March 14th, 1993, a Sunday. Dale Hutchins was 41 years old, standing in the farmyard his father had worked for 37 years, and he was trying to decide whether to make a purchase that would either save the operation or end it. His father had been dead for 6 months. The farm was 480 acres of corn and soybeans in central Illinois, just outside a town called Winona. It had been in the family since 1961. His father, Robert, had run it carefully. He hired help when he needed it. He rented equipment he couldn't afford. He never borrowed more than he could pay back in 2 good years. He died of a heart attack in the shop while changing oil on a disc harrow that was older than Dale. Dale had come home to help his mother. He had been working construction in Bloomington. He was single. He had no children. There was no one else. His older brother had moved to Arizona in 1985 and rarely called. His sister lived in Peoria and visited once a month, but had made it clear she wanted no part of the farm. So Dale moved back into the house where he grew up. He took over the operation, and within 3 months, he realized he couldn't do it the way his father had. His father had managed with a crew of 3 during planting and harvest. Dale couldn't afford that. His mother had made it clear there was no money for labor. The estate was still being settled. Medical bills from his father's final months had taken more than anyone expected. The margins on the farm had been thin for years, and now they were thinner. Dale needed horsepower. He needed a tractor that could pull everything his father had used 2 machines to handle. He needed something that could work dawn to dark without help. He needed a Case IH 7140 Magnum. He had seen one at the dealership in El Paso, 20 miles north. It was used, a 1991 model with 1,800 hours. It had been traded in by a farmer who'd upgraded to a newer model. The dealer wanted $32,000. Dale had spoken to him twice. The second time, the dealer had offered financing at 9% over 7 years. Dale's mother didn't want him to buy it. She told him that on a Saturday morning in March, standing in the kitchen while he drank coffee and looked at the numbers he'd written on a pad of paper, she said his father had never borrowed that kind of money for a single piece of equipment. She said there were other ways. She said he could rent a tractor for the season, hire it done, find a neighbor willing to trade labor. Dale told her those options wouldn't work long term. She told him she wasn't thinking long term. She was thinking about keeping the farm alive until they could sell it. That was the first time Dale realized his mother thought the farm would be sold. He didn't argue with her. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket and went outside. The next day he drove to the dealership. He signed the papers. He financed the Case IH 7140 Magnum for 7 years at 9%. The payments were $512 a month. He drove it home on a flatbed trailer because he didn't want to put road miles on it before the season started. His mother watched from the kitchen window. She didn't come outside. Dale unloaded the tractor himself. He parked it in the machine shed next to his father's old farmall that hadn't run in 2 years. The Magnum was red and clean and enormous. It had a cab with air conditioning and a radio. It had 145 horsepower at the PTO. It could pull a 14-bottom plow or a 30-foot field cultivator without laboring. Dale sat in the cab for 20 minutes that evening. He didn't start it. He just sat there with his hands on the wheel, looking out at the farmyard, trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. The tractor gave him what he needed that first year. He planted 480 acres in 9 days, working alone. He cultivated without hiring help. He ran equipment his father would have needed a second operator for. The Magnum didn't break down. It didn't overheat. It didn't complain. But the payments were $512 a month, and that changed how Dale thought about everything. He started calculating costs differently. Seed, chemicals, fuel, repairs, all of it now had to account for that monthly number. He couldn't let a field sit idle. He couldn't afford to wait for better prices. He couldn't take a week off if something else needed attention. By the end of that first year, Dale realized he needed more ground. There were 160 acres adjacent to the family farm that had been rented by a neighbor, Ed Corner, for the past 12 years. Ed was 73 years old. His son had no interest in farming. Ed had mentioned twice in passing that he might not renew the lease for 1994. Dale approached him in November of 1993. They met at the co-op in Winona. Dale offered to take over the lease. Ed asked what he'd pay. Dale offered the same rate Ed had been paying, $60 an acre. Ed told him the landowner had been asking for $70. Dale said he'd pay $70. They shook hands. Dale signed the lease in December. Starting in the spring of 1994, he'd be farming 640 acres. His mother asked him how he planned to manage that much ground alone. Dale said the Magnum could handle it. She said that wasn't what she'd asked. The 160 acres Dale leased were not like the family farm. They were lower ground, poorly drained, with heavier clay soil that held water longer in the spring. His father had looked at that land years ago and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Ed Corner had made it work, but Ed had always been willing to plant late and accept lower yields. Dale didn't have that luxury. He had payments to make. He needed every acre to produce. In the spring of 1994, he tilled the new ground hard. He installed some tile drainage himself, working weekends with a rented trencher. He applied extra fertilizer to try to boost the soil. He planted the same week he planted his family's ground, even though the new acres were still wetter than they should have been. The crop came up. It looked decent in June. By July, it was clear something was wrong. The corn on the new ground was stunted. The roots hadn't developed properly. The wet spring had compacted the soil, and Dale's aggressive tillage had made it worse. By August, he knew the yield would be poor. By September, he knew he'd lose money on those 160 acres. But he kept farming them, because the lease was signed, because he'd already put the inputs in, because stopping would mean admitting he'd made a mistake. That fall, Dale harvested his family's 480 acres first. The yields were average, enough to cover costs and make the payment on the Magnum. Then he harvested the 160 acres he'd leased. The corn averaged 78 bushels per acre. The soybeans averaged 31. The landowner got his $70 an acre. Dale got what was left, which after inputs was almost nothing. His mother asked him if he planned to renew the lease. Dale said he didn't have a choice. If he didn't farm those acres, someone else would, and the Magnum needed the work. That was the logic he used. The tractor needed the work. He renewed the lease for 1995 and 1996 and every year after that. The new ground never got better. Dale tried different tillage methods. He added more tile. He adjusted his planting dates. He experimented with cover crops and no-till and variable rate fertilizer. Some years were worse than others, but none of them were good. The soil had been damaged. Dale knew that. Everyone knew that. But no one said it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean acknowledging that the damage had been done by him. By 1998, Dale had been farming for 5 years. The Case IH 7140 Magnum had 4,200 hours on it. It still ran well. He'd replaced the clutch once and the hydraulic pump once, but those were expected repairs. The tractor had done what he'd asked it to do. But the payments were still $512 a month. And Dale was still farming ground that didn't pay for itself. His mother's health had started to decline. She had diabetes that wasn't well controlled. She had high blood pressure. She spent more time in town, staying with Dale's sister in Peoria, and less time on the farm. Dale saw her less. They spoke less. When they did speak, she didn't ask about the farm anymore. She didn't ask about the Magnum. She didn't ask about the leased ground. She had stopped expecting him to make different choices. In 2000, Dale paid off the Case IH 7140 Magnum. It had taken 7 years. The final payment was in March, the same month he'd signed the papers. He made the payment at the bank in Winona, and the woman behind the counter congratulated him and stamped his loan book paid in full. Dale drove home and parked the Magnum in the shed and sat in the cab for a long time, the same way he had the day he brought it home. He thought he'd feel relief. He thought there'd be some sense of accomplishment. But mostly what he felt was tired. The tractor was paid off, but the farm still wasn't profitable. The 160 acres were still underperforming. His mother was still in Peoria most of the time, and Dale was still alone, working dawn to dark, managing an operation that had never grown the way he thought it would. But he kept going, because that's what you did. The years from 2000 to 2010 were a blur of sameness. Corn prices went up, then down, then up again. Fuel costs climbed. Input costs climbed faster. Dale kept farming the same 640 acres. He kept working alone. The Magnum kept running. He rebuilt the transmission in 2003. He replaced the rear axle seals in 2005. He repainted the hood in 2007 after it started to rust through. The tractor had over 9,000 hours on it by then, but it still started every morning, and it still pulled everything he asked it to pull. In 2008, Dale's mother died. She had a stroke in Peoria and passed away 3 days later without regaining consciousness. Dale's sister handled most of the arrangements. The funeral was in Winona. 47 people attended. Most of them were his mother's age or older. Most of them remembered his father. After the funeral, Dale and his sister met with a lawyer to settle the estate. The farm was left to both of them, with the understanding that Dale would buy out his sister's half if he wanted to keep it. His sister told him she didn't want money right away. She told him to take his time. She told him she understood the farm wasn't worth what it used to be. Dale bought her out over 3 years. He borrowed again, but not much. The farm was paid off by 2011. That spring, Dale turned 59 years old. He'd been farming alone for 18 years. The Case IH 7140 Magnum had been the center of the operation the entire time. It had over 10,000 hours on it. The paint was faded, the cab door didn't seal quite right, the air conditioning had stopped working in 2009, and Dale had never fixed it. But the tractor still ran, and Dale still needed it. In late April of 2011, during spring planting, the Magnum's engine began to knock. Dale was pulling a 30-foot planter through the northwest corner of the leased ground when he heard it. A deep, rhythmic knocking from somewhere inside the block. He shut the tractor down immediately and climbed out. He opened the hood and checked the oil. It was full. He checked the coolant. It was fine. He restarted the engine. The knocking was still there, louder now. Dale shut it down again and called the Case IH dealer in El Paso. They sent a mechanic out the next day. The mechanic listened to the engine for less than a minute and told Dale it was a rod bearing. He said the engine would need to be rebuilt or replaced. Dale asked how much. The mechanic said a rebuild would cost between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on what else they found when they tore it down. A replacement engine would cost more. Dale asked how long the tractor could run as is. The mechanic said it couldn't. If Dale kept using it, the bearing would seize, the rod would break, and the engine block would be destroyed. The mechanic left. Dale stood in the field next to the Magnum and looked at the rows he still needed to plant. He had 180 acres left to go. He had a planter hooked to a tractor that couldn't run, and he had no way to finish the job without spending money he didn't have. He called 2 neighbors. One of them, a man named Vern Schaefer, agreed to finish Dale's planting with his own equipment. Vern didn't charge him. He said they'd figure it out later. Dale thanked him and told him he'd pay him back however he could. Vern finished the planting in 4 days. Dale helped where he could, but mostly he just watched. When the planting was done, Dale had the Magnum towed back to the farmyard. He parked it in the shed next to the equipment his father had used decades ago. He covered it with a tarp, and he started looking into what it would cost to fix. The rebuild estimate came back at $11,000. The dealer in El Paso said they could do the work, but it would take 6 weeks, and they'd need half the money up front. Dale didn't have $11,000. He didn't have half of $11,000. The farm had some equity, but not enough to justify another loan. His sister had been paid off. His mother was gone. There was no one to borrow from. He started calling other dealers. He called independents. He called mechanics who worked out of their garages. Everyone gave him the same answer. Rebuilding the engine on a 1991 Case IH 7140 Magnum would cost between $9,000 and $13,000, and parts availability was becoming an issue. One mechanic told him the tractor wasn't worth fixing. He said the resale value on a non-running Magnum from that era was maybe $4,000. He said Dale would be better off selling it for parts and buying something newer. Dale asked what he was supposed to use in the meantime. The mechanic didn't have an answer. For the first time in 18 years, Dale didn't have a tractor. He rented equipment that summer. He borrowed a tractor from Vern to run the cultivator. He hired a custom operator to do the spraying. He cobbled together a harvest plan using a neighbor's combine and another neighbor's grain cart. It worked. Barely. The crops came off. The yields were average. Dale made enough to cover his costs. But the whole time, the Magnum sat in the shed under a tarp, and Dale couldn't stop thinking about it. He thought about the day he bought it. He thought about his mother standing in the kitchen telling him not to. He thought about the 160 acres he'd leased because the tractor needed the work. He thought about the 18 years he'd spent managing a farm built around a machine that now couldn't run. In the fall of 2011, Dale made a decision. He wasn't going to fix the Magnum. He wasn't going to sell it. He was going to leave it where it was and figure out a different way forward. He bought a used tractor from a farm auction in Bureau County. It was a different brand, smaller, older, but it ran. He paid cash. It cost him $6,200. It wasn't enough tractor for 640 acres, but it was enough to keep going. Over the next 2 years, Dale slowly dismantled the operation he'd built. He didn't renew the lease on the 160 acres. The landowner found another renter within a month. Dale went back to farming just the family's 480 acres. He sold off equipment he didn't need anymore. He simplified. The farm became smaller, quieter, more like what his father had run. In 2014, Dale turned 62. He started collecting Social Security. He still farmed, but he hired help for planting and harvest. He stopped working dawn to dark. He started going to town more often. He started spending time with people instead of equipment. The Case IH 7140 Magnum stayed in the shed. Dale didn't uncover it. He didn't move it. He didn't talk about it. But he thought about it. He thought about what it had given him. Independence, capability, the ability to work alone when he had no other choice. The tractor had done exactly what he'd needed it to do. He also thought about what it had cost him. The payments, the leased ground, the soil damage, the years spent managing an operation that had grown too large for one person, the distance that had formed between him and his mother. He didn't know if buying the tractor had been the right choice. He didn't know if farming the extra acres had been worth it. He didn't know if his father would have been proud or disappointed. All he knew was that he'd made a decision in 1993, and that decision had shaped the next 20 years of his life in ways he never could have predicted. In 2018, Dale decided to retire. He was 66 years old. He'd been farming for 25 years. His body hurt in ways it hadn't used to. His knees were bad. His back was worse. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. He sold the family farm to a neighbor who planned to add it to his own operation. The sale went through in November. Dale moved to a small house in Winona, 2 blocks from the co-op where he used to buy seed. Before the sale closed, Dale went back to the farm one last time. He walked through the machine shed. He looked at the equipment that was being sold with the property, and he stood in front of the Case IH 7140 Magnum, still covered with the same tarp he'd put over it 7 years earlier. He pulled the tarp back. The tractor looked the same. The paint was faded. The tires were flat. The cab door still didn't seal right, but it was still there, still whole, still the machine that had defined half his life. Dale didn't start it. He didn't try. He just stood there for a while, his hand on the hood, thinking about everything the tractor represented. The neighbor who bought the farm asked Dale if he wanted to keep the Magnum. He said it wasn't worth much, but if Dale wanted it, he could haul it off. Dale thought about it. He thought about towing it to his new place, fixing it up, keeping it as some kind of monument to the years he'd spent farming. But he said no. He told the neighbor to do whatever he wanted with it. Sell it, scrap it, leave it in the shed. It didn't matter. The neighbor said he'd probably sell it for parts. Dale nodded. That seemed right. Dale left the farm that day and didn't go back. He heard later that the Magnum had been sold to a salvage yard in Henry County. They'd stripped it for parts and scrapped the rest. Someone had bought the engine, even though it was blown. Someone else had bought the rear end. The cab had gone to a farmer in Stark County who needed glass and sheet metal for his own Magnum. The tractor had been divided up and scattered across central Illinois, pieces of it still working on farms Dale would never see. And Dale was fine with that. He spent his first year of retirement doing very little. He read, he watched television, he went to the co-op in the mornings and drank coffee with men his age who'd also sold their farms. They talked about weather and grain prices and equipment they used to own. Sometimes Dale thought about the 160 acres he'd leased. He drove past them once in the spring of 2019. The land looked the same. The soil was still heavy. The drainage was still poor. But someone was farming it. Someone was making it work, or at least trying to. Dale wondered if they knew the history. He wondered if they knew the ground had been damaged. He wondered if they cared. He also thought about his mother. He thought about the conversation they'd had in the kitchen in 1993 when she'd told him not to buy the Magnum. He thought about how she'd been right in some ways and wrong in others. She'd been right that the tractor would cost more than he expected. She'd been right that it would change the farm. She'd been right that it would lead him down a path he might not have chosen otherwise. But she'd been wrong about one thing. She'd thought the farm would be sold. She'd thought Dale would give up, and he hadn't. He'd kept it going for 25 years. He'd made it work, even when it shouldn't have. Whether that was something to be proud of, Dale still didn't know. In the spring of 2021, Dale was 69 years old. He was sitting on the porch of his house in Winona, watching the sun come up, when he saw a Case IH tractor drive past on the county road. It was a newer model, bigger than the Magnum he'd owned, with a fully enclosed cab and GPS guidance and technology Dale didn't understand. The tractor was pulling a planter, heading out to the fields north of town. The driver was young, maybe 30, and he was alone in the cab, the same way Dale had been for so many years. Dale watched the tractor until it disappeared over the hill, and he thought about the decision that young man had made, or was making, or would make. He thought about the equipment that man had financed, the ground he was farming, the years ahead of him. Dale didn't know if that young man had made the right choice. No one ever knew. You made a decision, and you lived with it. And eventually you found out what it cost. That was farming. That was all it had ever been. Dale finished his coffee and went inside. The sun was up, the day had started, and somewhere out in those fields the work continued, the same way it always had. The Case IH 7140 Magnum had given Dale the power to farm alone. It had given him independence. It had allowed him to take over his father's operation when no one else could. But it had also locked him into farming ground that never should have been farmed. It had isolated him from his mother. It had consumed 20 years of his life in pursuit of something he was never quite sure was worth pursuing. The machine had solved one problem, and in solving it, it had created another. And by the time Dale understood that, it was far too late to undo any of it. He had bought the tractor to honor his father's farm, but in doing so, he may have destroyed what his father had actually built. That question stayed with Dale. It followed him into retirement. It sat with him on quiet mornings when he had nothing else to think about. He never answered it. Because some questions don't have answers. They just have consequences. And those consequences stretch across decades, long after the machine has stopped running, long after the fields have been sold, long after the work is done. Dale lived with that. And he kept living, because that was all anyone could do.